First, she smiled. First, she called. First, she said she was sorry. Her voice had the same slow tenderness it always had when she wanted something. She had learned the right cadence. She had learned how to make pity sound like a favor. I answered. I listened. I believed for a little while that the line between love and obligation could be rearranged by conversation. She told me about accidents. She told me about loneliness. She painted a careful portrait of a life that needed saving. Her details were precise. Her pauses were timed. When she asked to stay with us for just a few weeks, she signed the request with the softness of a question. We said yes. We folded her arrival into the calendar the way people fold themselves into plans they think they can control. He kissed my forehead like a scientist labeling a sample. He said, "I'll make room." I said, "Of course." We were generous because the world expects generosity of people who are married and secure. She arrived with 2 suitcases and a small smile. She filled the spare room with objects that smelled like someone else, lavender that belonged to her, books with spines softened by different hands, a chipped mug she said made her feel brave. We made coffee. She said thank you. She watched us closely. The first week was invisible. She folded laundry with the kind of deliberation that looks kind and ends up knowing the fabric of your nights. She asked questions about old fights, as if they were academic curiosities. She learned our rhythms. She learned what we called each other at 3 a.m. Small things shifted. The cereal box was moved to the back of the pantry. A note appeared on the fridge, inked in a careful hand, reminding us about bills. She corrected the thermostat schedule. She suggested we try new recipes as if our old meals were a symptom. It was gentle. It was patient. It had the kind of patience you reserve for a garden you want to claim as your own. I noticed patterns. We all notice patterns if we are trying to read the weather of a house. Her phone calls came at times when we were usually busy. She forgot to mention plans she made that included him. She sat a little too close at movie nights and laughed at jokes she already knew the punchline to. When I mentioned it, she smiled and said, "I'm just grateful. Gratitude is useful. It blunts suspicion like a hand on a blade." Then the tests began. They were small at first. A misplaced calendar invite here. A half-finished sentence about something he said in private, repeated in the kitchen as if uncertain. She learned what annoyed him. She used those things like instruments. She invented favors that required time. She needed help moving a box of memories. She asked him to drive her to the pharmacy at midnight. She asked him to fix the cabinet light that only flickered when rain was coming. He obliged. He was easy to oblige. He is the kind of man who thinks help is a language of love. I became an observer. Observation is a slow, patient form of grief. I recorded small things in my head the way one records weather. Date, time, trivial note. I did not want to believe in conspiracy. Conspiracy requires motive, and motive was the one thing she never let slip, until she did. One night, over wine, she let a phrase fall. She said, "You always did get the things I wanted." It sounded like a complaint. It sounded like a confession. She smiled, and in that smile was a map. After that, the behavior sharpened. She placed moral little trinkets in the apartment, books about boundaries, flyers for seminars on communication, a pamphlet about financial independence. At dinner, she initiated debates that were always gently angled toward my mistakes. "You let him skip therapy," she would say. "You let things slide." Her words were tiny wedges. There were messages. Anonymous notes left in drawers. A stranger's text that asked if my husband was really happy. She did not need to send them. She needed them to exist. He noticed fractures in me that I had not yet identified. He saw the way I flinched when our conversations circled back to the past. He asked if I was okay. I lied. Lies are sometimes mercies. She was clever. Her cleverness had the patience of a weaver. She made patterns that looked accidental until you tried to unravel them. She borrowed money from me in ways that ensured I would feel guilty if I asked for it back. She borrowed favors that ensured he would be in the middle of the night doing things that used his time and not ours. Sometimes she cried. Her tears were small, precise things that crept under your defenses. She would say, "I just don't want to be alone." Loneliness is a currency people spend on you when they want something. I began to change how I spoke. I trimmed details. I stopped telling him small things about my day that made me vulnerable. I edited laughter and left out the punchlines that might have made me look less strong. Her invasions were clinical. She rearranged the history of our relationship with the softest brushstrokes, a story told differently at a party, a memory corrected in conversation, an anecdote reframed to make me look less graceful. One evening, she invited his coworkers over. She orchestrated casual conversations about living arrangements and who does what, as if she were moderating a town hall about our private life. She made jokes that landed like seeds. Weeks later, when a coworker mentioned something in passing, it sounded like evidence. I confronted her once. I asked why she kept inserting herself into the margins of our life. She smiled. She said, "I only want what's best for you." She said it as if it absolved her of choice. When the first real crack appeared, it was not from a fight. It came from a misunderstanding she invited and then magnified. She forwarded an old text of mine, taken out of context, to a group of people who meant to be supportive. The text read like an apology for something I had never apologized for. People reacted. People speculated. Rumor is a rapid fire that consumes the small, private things first. He asked me about it in the kitchen. His questions were calm. He trusted me in the way people trust the map of a place they know better than a stranger does. I explained. I showed him the full thread, the timestamps, the context. His jaw unknotted as facts arranged themselves. He said, "That doesn't sound like you." I almost told him everything then. But confession is a slow currency. Instead, we made a plan that felt almost adult. He would speak to her. He would set boundaries. We would not make the house into a courtroom. He respected conciliatory scripts. So he asked her, politely, to stop forwarding things. She agreed. She said she would be careful. But agreements are porous when the intent beneath them is solid. She kept pushing. She took longer phone calls in the late afternoon. She left notes in drawers that implied other secrets. She started to make him small gifts, things that required the intimate knowledge of someone who watched you get dressed. And then she did something bold. She told a story to a person he once dated. She told it in the cadence of an eyewitness. The story painted me as reckless. It painted her as the wronged party. She used details she could not have known unless she had been present at an earlier time in our lives, details that were true but framed. Messages arrived. Old friends asked questions they believed were innocent. He read them with the expression of someone watching small cracks widen in a concrete wall. We argued quietly in the hallway. We argued because the subject was not her, it was us. We argued because it is easier to divide when the enemy looks like your family. I became meticulous. I documented. Receipts, messages, small proofs piled up in a drawer like bones waiting for a skeleton. I did not want to be the person who built a case. But to survive manipulation, you must sometimes become a witness to your own life. She noticed that I noticed. She changed tactics. She went quiet in theatrical ways. Silence is a trick when you are the one who has been loud. She called fewer times. She smiled across the table with a practiced resignation that asked for forgiveness before the sin was committed. Then, one afternoon, she left a drawer open near my makeup. Inside was an envelope with a name I had not seen in years. It was an address that belonged to a life I had tried to forget. She had dug into the past with an archaeologist's patience. She set artifacts where my hands would find them. I felt anger like a cold pulse. Anger is a clear lens. It defines edges. I sat with it. I told him. He listened. He took the envelope. He read it in the same slow, measured way he reads everything that matters. Then something shifted without a sound. He folded the paper and put it back in the drawer. He said, "We will handle this together." Those words are scaffolding. They hold. He spoke to her in the kitchen with a calm that was not weakness. He said plainly, "You have to go." She looked at him as if he had read a different script. She laughed in a small, surprised way. Then her hands found the edge of the counter and her laughter stopped. She packed slower than anyone I had ever known could pack. She moved the things she loved to the bag last, as if by doing so she might salvage the heart of whatever plan she had been sowing. She hugged us both. Her hug was long. In it was the pause of someone who had rehearsed sorrow and then wondered who would applaud. For 2 days, nothing happened. It felt like a flat sea. Then, at night, he sat me down and said he wanted to tell me something he had been saving for a quiet moment. He told me he had been having a conversation with himself about what loyalty meant. He told me he had been keeping a quiet watch over my sadness like a lamp. He said, "You didn't have to make a case." He said, "You were never the one I doubted." Words like that are softer than any shield. They do not erase the history, but they rearrange the furniture of memory. She left. Her departure had a sound like fabric on tile. We watched the car until it was a dot. We closed the door, and then we did the small domestic things that recovery requires: washing the sheets, throwing away the leftover yogurt, rekeying locks if you feel you must. Relief was uneven. It came in curlicues. At breakfast, he was warm and ordinary. At some point in the day, I would catch my breath and feel the rawness left where trust had been manipulated. We spoke in careful sentences about boundaries. We decided we would never again allow a guest to become a cartographer of our intimacy. Then the first true unraveling began. She called him from a withheld number. She said, with that same trained softness, that she had changed her mind. She said she had been foolish. She said she wanted to come back. He listened. He hung up. He told me. He said, "She asked to come back." I felt my stomach fold in a way I had not expected. I had thought departure would be the end. I had not accounted for the persistence of want. We said no. We said it politely. We said it with the kind of firmness that is learned over small contracts and calls for clarity. She did not take no as a line to be respected. She took it as a challenge to be reframed. Over the next week, she began to construct a narrative outside our walls. She told mutual acquaintances that we had been cruel. She told them we had thrown her out without understanding. Rumor is a patient animal. It eats at the corners of things until the edges blur. People began to ask questions again, whispers arranged like staccato notes. Her stories found small audiences. She was good at making a scene in a place where she was not present. I became thoughtful in new ways. I learned that protection is not always loud. Sometimes it is choosing which invitations to accept. Sometimes it is deciding which fights are worth making public. I saved messages that proved context. I invited witnesses to small dinners who knew me well. I practiced being ordinary in front of people who knew the truth. Then, unexpectedly, she altered her target. She began to court my mother. She called her with the same gentle cadence she had used on me. She told stories of shared childhood memories that were only half true. She offered help around the house with the tender energy of someone who wants to be indispensable. My mother is careful about people. She has a soft spot for anyone who mentions cold winters and soup recipes. She found herself drawn into late afternoon visits. We began to see our family life reframed at the edges. Her presence could now be described as supportive in places that mattered. I called her. I asked her to stop. She said nothing. Silence can be a choice as loud as any accusation. Then a message arrived that changed the landscape. An old friend of hers, a person who had been a part of her life before she ever came to our house, sent a photo. It was a picture of her in a small cafe 2 towns over, smiling at someone I did not know. There was a book in her hand, one she had insisted on borrowing from my husband's study months ago. The person who sent the photo appended a small note. "Do you know what she's up to?" I felt the ground shift under a phrase. I realized she had a pattern I had not anticipated. She was collecting testimonies, people who would say she'd been kind, people who would say she'd been hurt. She was assembling an audience that could be directed to see only one act of a play. We decided to be direct. He called the friend who sent the photo. He asked what she knew. He was not accusatory. He was matter-of-fact. The friend told him more than I expected, about phone calls at odd hours, about offers of help that morph into requests, about a carefully curated narrative. It felt for a moment like sunlight passing through blinds. The pattern became a picture. There was a deliberate reach to her actions. She was not merely lonely. She was trying to redraw a life map that excluded the lines that made us stable. We were ready then, almost unknowingly. We talked to people. We spoke in clear sentences about what had happened while avoiding the trap of needing to make everyone believe every detail. There is a kind of dignity in stating simple facts. We stated facts. We let other people come to their own conclusions. But she did not stop. She escalated. She started to leave things in places that would be found at the wrong time. She folded notes into the spines of books we lent to others. She called in favors that required us to explain ourselves to neighbors and friends. And then, finally, she made a mistake. Not a big mistake. A small, ill-considered one. She wrote an email from an account she thought we did not know she had. She CC'd someone who recognized the voice in the cadence and decided to respond. The response threaded truth with details only an insider could have known. We read it together. We read how she had described things she had not lived but had framed as if she had. The email contained an admission in the way a map contains a landmark. She had written plainly that she wanted to reset the balance between us. She had written about times she had intervened and how those interventions were necessary. There is a breath you take before you act. It contains possibility. It contains fear. We sat in that breath, not sure whether relief or revenge would come first. He told me he would call her and ask her to stop. He told me he would be firm. I wanted to ask him to be harsher. I wanted to see her struck down by the exact force she had used. But there is a strange nobility in restraint. He called. She answered with a voice that was practiced and, for a moment, persuasive. He spoke. She promised. He asked for proof of that promise. She sent a photo, a staged one of herself on a bus leaving town. We believed, briefly. Then the next day someone sent a message with a location she had been seen, close to the places she had once worked. The bus photo had been an act of theater. She was still moving like a tide around us. He changed his strategy. Instead of talking, he documented. We compiled dates. We had names. We had proof that the pattern was not a misreading but an orchestration. We were ready then to ask for help. Not a legal kind of help at first. A kind of help that lives in community. Neighbors who knew what kindness looked like, friends who remembered earlier versions of ourselves, family members who could be asked to witness. We gathered the small network that holds people together when weather is bad. We spoke in calm, factual sentences. We did not scream. We let our steady voices be heavier than her small storms. Her response was swift. She posted on social media in a voice that made the ordinary look like cruelty. She sent messages to people we barely knew explaining how hurt she had been. The world loves a wounded actor. It leans in. But a different thing happened too. People who had known us for a long time remembered. They remembered dinners where we were light. They remembered small generosities she had ignored in public. Testimony is a quiet weapon. She began to look erratic. Not the erratic of fury. The erratic of someone who is losing a carefully edited narrative. Her posts grew defensive. Her calls grew plaintive. 1 week later, she arrived at the wrong house. She knocked at the door of a neighbor who had nothing to do with our story. She asked for help in a voice that was, finally, honest. The neighbor called us. She was there, small and shaking, as if the long work of acting had exhausted her. We sat with her on the back steps where the light was gentle. "Whoa," she cried. Not the precise tears she had used to manipulate. These were ragged human ones. She said, "I didn't know how else to be seen." That sentence is a small, terrible confession. She did not say she was sorry in the way I wanted. Apologies are not always a neat return to balance. Sometimes they are the beginning of a different map. We made a decision that felt both merciful and stern. We offered her help that involved boundaries, counseling, a plan for independence, distance while she rebuilt. She accepted in a way that looked like surrender. She left town again, this time with a bag and with a number for a counselor we had found. For days after she left, the house felt like a place that had been examined and then stitched. We moved slowly through it like people who have survived weather and learned to make tea. We talked less about blame and more about how to keep the walls private. We rebuilt rituals, a certain song on Sundays, a coffee on the porch, a line we used when one of us felt small. But the world does not forget the shape of the storm immediately. There were lingering questions from people who had been told different things. There were small wounds to explain. We answered in the patient tone of people who have learned that survival is not dramatic, but continuous. Then, a month later, an envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a letter written in a hand I knew too well. She wrote about herself in a voice that moved between apology and a plea for understanding. She said she had started to see a counselor. She said she was trying to learn what it meant to be alone without reaching for other people's lives to anchor herself. There is a kind of fragile truce that follows such letters. It is held together by the small choices people make after the big event, choosing to answer calls, choosing to visit, choosing to keep boundaries. We answered with a note that accepted the letter without endorsing its drama. We closed the exchange with the kind of clarity that had been absent before. In the weeks that followed, life resumed its ordinary claim. There were dinners that did not contain performative sorrow. There were movies watched without interruption. There were mornings we woke with the small, fierce gratitude of people who have not been broken by the same thing twice. But we were different. Not worse. Not scandalized in the way the tabloids would have loved. We were quieter, more deliberate. We had learned the craft of protection. She had tried to destroy the shape of our marriage with small, patient cuts. She had imagined that by moving the furniture of our private life slowly enough, she could make us disoriented. She had underestimated two things: the stubbornness of the person she had hurt, and the fact that love sometimes grows a defense where you least expect it. And yet, the story is not clean. There are days I still think of her smile. There are nights I catch myself apologizing in my head for things I never did. Forgiveness is not a single act. It is a calendar you move through slowly, one day at a time. Sometimes I imagine what would have happened if we had been less kind. Would she have left sooner? Would she have been forced to rebuild without the scaffolding we offered? I do not know. I only know what happened. She tried to destroy us. She tried to redraw the lines of our lives so that the map did not fit anymore. But maps are made of more than one line. They are made of the ways people return after being lost. We kept living. We made small defenses, passwords, boundaries, rituals. We made a new language for our home, one that included phrases like, "We do not discuss this with strangers," and "If you need help, call this number." Once, months later, I saw her in a market 3 aisles over. She was smaller than I remembered. She saw me. She looked away. I wanted to speak. I wanted to ask if she was better. I wanted to know whether the silences she had cultivated were learning or avoidance. I did not approach her. I watched her leave with her bag of oranges. I felt a small, abiding thing settle, a kind of peace that is not triumph but survival. The house hummed with ordinary sounds the rest of the day. He made coffee. We laughed about a silly thing on the radio. We ate dinner without an audience. We kept the light low. In the end, her plan did not succeed the way she intended. It did not collapse us into ruin. It made us, strangely, more deliberate. It taught us to watch the seams of our life with careful hands. There are nights I still hear the echo of her laughter in the hallway. There are mornings I wake and write a small list of things I will not allow to be moved: our rituals, our privacy, our small, brutal kindnesses. She wanted to destroy my marriage. She wanted, I think now, to be seen as the heroine of a story only she had written. Instead, she became a chapter we turned together. We read it, then put it down. We closed the book and went on. And yet, the secret between us is softer than triumph. It is a small agreement not to let strangers map the borders of our love. It is a recognition that people who hurt are sometimes the people who need help the most. It is an acknowledgement that protection sometimes looks like mercy. We learned to speak in reservations. I need this. I can't do that. We will not involve others. We learned to tell our story in its true order. We learned how to be ordinary and fierce at once. There will be more days. There will be new weather. But we have a map now that is ours, not one stitched by other hands. We keep it folded gently between the pages of our lives. First, she came with a smile. First, she asked to stay. First, she made small moves that looked like kindness. It took time to see the pattern. It took patience to respond. It took the steadiness of a man who chose to listen and the vigilance of a woman who learned to document. In the quiet after, we rebuilt the ordinary. We did not pretend the work was easy. We only pretended the work was worth it. Because it was. She tried to destroy my marriage. She failed because the thing she sought to break was not brittle. It had years of small repairs and laughter and shared grocery lists that made it unexpectedly resilient. We survived not because we were perfect, but because we learned to refuse being mapped by other people's stories. She left, and the silence that followed was not empty so much as full of the little unpaid errands of intimacy. We learned to answer questions that had once passed between us without explanation. We learned to say, plainly, "I did not tell her that." We learned to leave no loose threads where someone might tie a story. We kept to small domestic proofs of normalcy. We bought a new set of towels and placed them in the hall. We made our bed with a little more care. We made a list of people to call only when we meant to speak openly. Each mundane choice was a stitch. Each ordinary action was a way to say, silently, "We are not undone." Therapy became a kind of map we both read. We sat under fluorescent lights with a woman who wrote things down in a hand that looked like it belonged to someone who collects weather. She asked simple questions. She asked what felt unsafe. She asked what we needed to name aloud. Talking unhooked small, slithering anxieties from their hiding places. We learned sentences such as, "When you do X, I feel Y," and we practiced them until they fit like a clean shirt. There were nights when I woke with the feeling that someone had rearranged the furniture of my mind. I would sit on the edge of the bed and count the breaths he had when he slept. I would listen for his breath like someone learning to read a new language. He would wake and find me staring at the darkness and hand me his hand like an anchor. We held hands until the house remembered how to be ordinary again. Friends came in small, surprising waves. Some had known us before the storm and returned like people who had kept an umbrella in the trunk. Others arrived late, apologetic and curious, armed with gentle questions that were more about listening than about judgment. One neighbor brought over a pie and said simply, "We thought you might like this." Those banal acts were loud in their steadiness. We set new rules that felt both constrictive and freeing. No overnight guests without prior agreement. No forwarding of private messages to strangers. If a topic felt raw, we would announce it and choose whether to continue. Some of these rules sounded like small legislations, but they were really etiquette for safety. They taught us how to keep the porch light on without leaving the door open. We repaired the garden together. We trimmed the dead branches and planted things that promised a return. Gardening, it turns out, is a humble school of patience. You nurture something, and then you wait to see if it answers. As the months passed, blossoms returned in small, persistent ways. A tulip where none had been expected, a tomato that ripened slow and sweet. Mail was still a place of uneasy surprises. Once, an advertisement arrived addressed to her, marked by hand with a penciled note. My stomach tightened. He opened it and tossed it straight into recycling. He said, "We will not give it weight." Saying it out loud diminished the paper's power. We were not always rational. There were afternoons when I found myself rereading old conversations, searching for the exact letter that could justify how I felt. There were evenings when I imagined new permutations of what she might do. Fear is a generator of hypothetical disasters. The therapist told me to notice the difference between a thought and an action. She told me to let the imagined storms pass through like weather. He learned too. He stopped answering calls from numbers he did not recognize. He left his phone face down at dinner. He began to rehearse lines that were not scripted but true. "We will not discuss our private life with acquaintances, and, if you want to help, here is what we need." There was a gentle firmness to him I had not seen before, less soft than before, but not harsh. We made agreements with other family members. My mother, who had been flattered and confused by her presence, agreed to phone when unsure and to ask us before letting things slide. My sister's old friends were given permission to speak honestly if they suspected something. We learned that boundaries are easiest to keep when they are shared. Once, in a crowded cafe, a woman approached us and said she had heard about what happened. She said she had been in a similar situation years ago. she said with a casual authority. "You did the right thing." For a moment, strangers' kindnesses carried more weight than any legal affirmation. It felt like being given a small, anonymous benediction. My sister sent postcards. They were short, honest lines about landscapes she had seen. They did not ask for permission to return. She wrote about an ocean and how it made her feel small and less dramatic. She signed with a name that felt both familiar and foreign. We kept the postcards in a drawer and read them sometimes, like small weather reports from a person learning a new climate. Her counselor wrote to us once, with our permission, to say she had been attending and that she was making slow, uneven progress. The letter was factual and brief. It felt like news from a neighbor we both trusted. We filed it with the other documents that measured the arc of time. There were anniversaries that landed oddly. The day she had first arrived, the day she had walked out, the day she had called to ask to come back, each came with a memory that did not fit neatly into a single emotion. Sometimes I felt grateful, sometimes I felt cheated, sometimes I felt exhausted by the amount of living I had to do in public. We learned to mark those days with small acts. A meal we liked, the radio turned to a familiar station, a conversation we had promised to keep between us. Curiosity returned, like a careful guest. I started painting again in the afternoons, small canvases of color that had nothing to do with explanation. He began to run again, taking routes that looped back to the house. Our life, previously streamlined into routine, now held pockets where surprise could happen. Those pockets were deliberate. We filled them with small experiments, a new recipe, a walk in a different park, a book read aloud over coffee. Sometimes the past intruded in the form of a stranger's question. At a party, someone asked casually, "Are you okay now?" I answered, because the truth is easier when it is true. We are okay. We are cautious. We are learning. Honesty is a short bridge between two people. It requires both of them to walk across together. Months passed. The frequency of the surprises diminished. She sent fewer postcards. She began to come to the edges of things rather than into their centers. She learned to be a story that could exist without dramatizing ours. Whether she did it out of genuine change or exhaustion was a question that never had to be fully answered. We found ourselves speaking to each other in shorthand. "Did you lock up?" meant more than the lock. "Did you tell Mom?" meant more than the phone call. Language condensed when the world around you had been noisy. We treasured small certainties. The smell of his cologne folded into the scarf he left on the chair, the way the kettle sang on rainy mornings, the mark he left on the grocery list where he always wrote, "milk." In quieter hours, I considered mercy. Mercy is not the same as forgetting. Mercy is not even the same as forgiveness. Mercy is a set of choices you make in the presence of someone's failure. You decide whether to help them stand, and on what terms. We decided to offer mercy with careful boundaries. We offered help that required responsibility. We offered space that required evidence of change. When she finally visited us again, months later and after much negotiation, she came for a single afternoon. She did not stay overnight. She brought wine and a small cake. We sat in the living room and the conversation was awkward in the way two people are when they are trying to be honest without indulging old scripts. She apologized in a way that was not cinematic. It was spare. She said she understood now that help could be an invasion. She said she had been working with someone to unlearn the habit of making other people the center of her relief. We accepted the apology with a caution that felt like a hand offered across a small table. We did not announce a reunion. We did not pretend we had not been hurt. We simply agreed to speak when things were clear and to call when they were not. The cake tasted like moderation. The wine tasted like a moment decided. Time, as it does, rearranged the edges. There were family dinners where she was present and behaved like a person learning to be a member again rather than an editor of other people's lives. There were quiet phone calls where she asked about recipes more than about secrets. Slowly, she occupied a smaller orbit, a more respectful one. Whether she would always remain that way was a question none of us could answer. We learned to accept uncertainty as part of the work. There were days when the memory of her manipulation came like a cold wind. I would catch myself measuring my words before saying them aloud, because habit can return without permission. He would sometimes start a sentence and then stop because he did not trust the audience of a phrase. We practiced patience with ourselves. We allowed mistakes to be small and explicable and repairable. We refused to let fear carve our days into smaller, guarded shapes. Once, when an old friend mentioned the episode in passing, I surprised myself by answering with a line that felt like a lesson. We were tested. We passed, imperfectly. Imperfection became our modest claim. We were not unbreakable. We were not invulnerable. We were people who had learned to repair the small things and to keep the door closed to those who would map our seams. Years, if not decades, will probably be the only honest measure of what changed permanently. People grow or not. They rest or they return to old patterns. We cannot control the entirety of another life. What we can control is the life we keep between us, the rituals, the small mercies, the rules we teach ourselves. On a quiet afternoon, he left a note on the kitchen counter. "Remember to water the succulents." I smiled and replied, in the same tidy script, "And pick up the mail." That exchange, so small, so domestic, felt like proof. It was not the proof of a perfect marriage. It was proof that two people could continue to choose each other after being pushed by another's needs and designs. Sometimes I think of the way we documented our days during that time: receipts, screenshots, photographs of messages laid out like evidence. Evidence, we discovered, is less about proving someone wrong than about proving to yourself that your experience is real. That validation is tender and private. It is the kind of thing you file away and revisit when the weather of your life gets stormy. We taught our friends and family how to be scaffolding without being spectacle. We asked that if anyone noticed anything odd, they would ask in private, not in public. We asked that people be witnesses before they were jurors. People honored this with an odd generosity that felt like a small miracle. Once, years later, my sister called on her birthday. She sent a short voice message with music in the background and said simply, "Happy birthday, I hope you're well." I listened to it 3 times. I played it for him. We did nothing public with it. We let it exist like a weather report that had come from far away, informative but not directive.